Woohoo! I missed you guys since the last time I saw you. I couldn't help myself. Here I am again. Well, you all know my name, Brock, and I'm at Occidental Arts and Ecology. It's Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, where I direct the Water Institute with Kate Lundquist, who's out in the audience, and talk to Kate about our beaver campaign. And then we also have our Permaculture Resilient Community Design program with Kendall Dunnigan, and then I run a Tending of the Wild program at OAC. And when Kenny was asking how long people have been here, I get to raise my hand on 24 years. My first Bioneers was in 1994 when it was at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. So it feels like with so many of you all, this has just been a quarter century of a family reunion coming together and, you know, really building into what we've been really calling regenerative thrivalism. Right? The thrivalists are the ones whose buns are dancing in the midst of survivalists. And it's regenerative. And with respect to the next speaker, I want to offer up basically a sense of gratitude for connection and a gratitude for community and conviviality. And on those themes, I just want us to take one big breath in and one big breath out and thank all that oxygen that you get to breathe, that the trees and plants gave to us, and feel the CO2 you're exhaling that the trees are going to be taking in as we begin to think about that tidal pulse, that inhalation and exhalation of that reverential reciprocity with all these other life forms that are sharing basically one of the great trade deals out there, if you will, right? This O2 CO2 global trade agreement, which is a trade agreement I can get on board with. I mean, imagine the miracle of photosynthesis, where there's a communion with chlorophyll and where water and CO2 joined, bathed by a solar shower of sunlight, spinning the wheel and crafting simple carbohydrates and putting out oxygen, which we're so grateful for as animals and fungi. And at some point when the photosynthetic critters figured this out, they got this evolutionary workaround on the food thing here. It was basically they could leverage that edge and offer up their capacity to make sugar onto the trade blanket of life. And pretty quickly, the trees basically were like, great, we got the hookup with the nuke plant 93 million miles away to make sugar, so we'll be your sugar mama. And then basically the mushrooms are like, well, that's cool, but I'm your mineral daddy because I'm going to basically get in and break down complex minerals and salt, and we're going to swing a deal. And this mycorrhizal root relationship between trees and plants and fungus is one of the great unseen miracles. As far as I can tell, basically, there's a sense that each of these life forms, expressions of life, get to offer their innate intelligence and their unique talents to convert either sunlight into sugar or break down minerals and then trade them in a living liquid carbon network, decentralized microbial, mycorrhizal, moisture-maintained midden of marvelousness. Right? And the beauty of it is all this, for the most part, was playing out underground, beneath our feet, out of sight, out of mind, as above, so below. And yet, for so long, folks weren't really able to track this and weren't really connecting with it. And it really wasn't until some decades ago that a series of intrepid scientists, and specifically a couple women in respect, actually, from up in British Columbia, basically, while many folks couldn't literally see the forest for the trees because most of the action was below their knees, some of these folks got down on their hands and their knees and got into this and got some dirt under the nails and really helped elucidate this amazing story. And so this morning, to help us with this unpacking of our subterranean soliloquy of our myco-mist tree, our speaker today is Dr. Teresa Ryan. And she's an Aboriginal Tsimshian woman and also a PhD from the University of British Columbia. And Dr. Ryan works directly with Professor Suzanne Simard, who unfortunately can't be with us this morning because of plane flight issues and canceled flights out of Portland. And so I was cramming last night late to work this out. And I must admit, in reading Dr. Ryan's biography and background, I'm convinced we're in for a real treat of comparable camaraderie and content. Dr. Ryan grew up in the rich rainforests of British Columbia, and where she, in her relations with her Aboriginal Tsimshian heritage, being with her grandfather who guided her in so many ways and especially directed her to a focus in the world of fisheries and salmon nation there, and their shared wonder about place. And it appears the elegance of that mentorship of liberating his granddaughter for a life of wonder and wandering and questioning and testing theories against the conventional scientific wisdom and against the legacy of colonial dispossession of Aboriginal lands in their region. It appears to me that Dr. Ryan has lived a life where she's followed a path that's been led by her direct experience with her lineage in her Aboriginal relationship and a training in Western scientific observation, which appears to have yielded a form of hybrid vigor, if you will, in insight into the relationships between tree roots and mycorrhizal fungi and marine-derived nitrogen that came from the bodies of spawned-out salmon that were defecated out by bears and eagles and otters and even some people who eat that flesh of the fish in the forest and fertilize the furs of the system to create and ingrain the webs of life below her deep green Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest. So Dr. Ryan will share with us some compelling stories of coevolution, of sunshine and sylvan soils and salmon streams and mushroom memes with reverential reciprocity themes and humble narratives of balancing both stories of humus and stories of human. With all the shared work being performed at the University of British Columbia, it is clear that her unrelenting creativity and smart scientific sleuthing shines so many rays of hope on the subtle subterranean synthesis of sunlight to sugar to soil in a seaside, sylvan, salmonid symphony of symbiosis for societal salvation. So all the way down from British Columbia, please give a warm Bioneers welcome for Dr. Teresa Ryan. Thank you, people.
Thank you,
Okay.
Thank you. Sim hayetsk duwayu. Nawapsh bihanax dawatsogu. Gitlan timsian dawawatku. Ganhara diptiksu. Lo Ryan bilhamnech wasnoyu. Insu elixar gu agelxu. Indoixin laxiupum coastal miwak. Amagan Slask. Good morning. Good afternoon. Hello. My name is Sim Hayetsk. I'm from the Gitlan tribe of the Tsimshian Nation. Sim Hayetsk means real copper. I belong to the House of Spihanax and to the Raven clan. I am deeply honored to speak with you today. Thank you, Nina and Kenny, for your vision and open hearts for bringing us Bioneers. Thank you, Brock, for the lovely introduction. In preparing for this talk, we note that our themes resonate with many speakers of the past, whether they are from an environmental, economic, or social science backgrounds. The universality indicates that we're on the right track. What I'm going to tell you about are some discoveries of connection, communication, and relationships in the forests. We, as creatures of this earth, already know this in our subconscious. My work simply raises it to our consciousness. It's my hope that we can use this knowledge for guiding actions to help deal with this existential crisis we face with climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the breakdown of our ecosystems. The first peoples of America have long articulated knowledge that I'm going to be sharing with you. In the ancient Halkomelem language of the Coast Salish, who have existed for over 10,000 years, they say, Insamat, we are one. The Nuchanal say, Hish ish tzuwalk, everything is one. And in Tsamaliak, my language, we say, Sait gudam God, of one heart. In indigenous worldviews, humans are an intimate part of nature. Our bodies, our minds, our hearts, and our spirits are connected to the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Our relationships with these elements ripple through our web of connections to affect global ecosystems. This concept of oneness is universal in indigenous cultures. There's a few examples of how this works. Last summer, Suzanne had the pleasure of meeting Ken Workman, the great-great-great-grandson of Chief South, or Seattle, of the Duwamish tribe. He described where he grew up, and in the forest of the Duwamish River, a place we now know as Seattle. He talked of the intimate connection of the Duwamish people to the trees and how they lived and worked and played and even buried their ancestors in the trees. The ones in the trees in time return to the soil and then become part of the trees. And so the generations of people live on in the trees and in the longhouses and canoes and totems made from those trees. Thus, many generations are all around the people, connecting those here in the present with the past and the future and with the natural world. Subiye, the late Bruce Miller of the Skokomish, the Salmon Nation, who lived just north of the Duwamish, also spoke of the ancient story of the tree people. Quoting from a climate action document of the Swinomish tribe, this ancient story tells how the trees have much to teach us in their diversity and symbiotic nature. Subiye said, quote, "Trees were to develop the most powerful method of teaching, and the teaching doesn't utilize language or words because it's teaching by example, which is the strongest form of teaching that can be established. Animals teach their young ones by example. Trees were placed on earth as an example of what true harmony and contribution is to the world. Their example was that they existed side by side from the very beginning of time with no criticism of one another." Suzanne calls these tree people the gentle giants, who, like the Coast Salish, are patiently waiting, like we all are, for the Western world to learn. The ancient story of the tree people told by Subiye goes on, quote, "Under the forest floor, there is an intricate and vast system of roots and fungi that keeps the forest strong." I will come back to this. Robin Kimmerer of the Potawatomi Nation, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, also talks so eloquently of, quote, "indigenous ways of thinking of plants, that they are recognized as people. Strawberries are berry people, and trees are tree people, who are persons of non-human species with their own intrinsic roles in the democracy of species. The plants and trees are sovereign beings with their own intelligence, their own wisdom, and their own responsibilities." Robin describes how the Potawatomi honor the plant people as the gifts of the earth through the honorable harvest. When you harvest, don't take everything, or even the first one. Second, ask permission. Explain why you need to harvest. Third, listen for the answer. And then if it's no, then walk away. Fourth, take only what you need. Fifth, use everything that you take. Sixth, when you harvest, minimize harm. 7, be grateful for the harvest. 8, share with your neighbors. And lastly and importantly, meet your responsibility to the earth by reciprocating with a gift of your own, such as through spreading of the seed, by defending the plants fiercely. Thank you, Robin, for sharing your teachings. This last point of meeting responsibility by reciprocating the gift using the honorable harvest is also advocated by me in my work. I am a fisheries scientist by training. The first peoples of the salmon forests in the Pacific Northwest, including the Tsimshian, my tribe, the Heiltsuk, the Haida, Tlingit, many others, harvested salmon, clams, ulakan, abalone, and many other resources for our livelihoods. We met our responsibility for these gifts by reciprocating with gifts of our own. For the clams, we made beds so they could reproduce in abundance along the beaches. For the salmon, we built rock walls along the shorelines called stone traps so they could passively trap the salmon, harvesting only the smaller fish when we needed them, but on the ebb tide, while letting the large ones escape, and the females. This way, populations were kept large, strong, and genetically diverse. I'll come back to this later. The Swinomish go on to say, quote, "It is vital that such teachings are not lost or forgotten. These teachings are indigenous science and are crucial to the survival of future generations to offer guidance and instruction in how one should live and thrive in what has become a very complex world to avoid a life out of balance." The colonizers of First Peoples have had and still do a very different worldview. Instead of taking only what is given from the earth, modern society has taken indiscriminately. This exploitive worldview permeates through our hierarchical social and institutional structures, our capitalist economy, and of course, treatment of the environment. In fact, we belittled Aboriginal ancestors for their faith, the Nsamat. People are connected in mind, body, heart, and spirit to rivers, salmon, bears. We ignored their cries as a society. When Canada was colonized, it was the Canadian government policy to take the Indian out of the child, using the residential school system, for all intents and purposes amounting to genocide. Suzanne lived across the river from one of these residential schools. She didn't notice what was going on behind the brick walls. And this causes her to feel shame of the history. She told me, in her own words, after we got to know each other and started working together, she said, "You have changed my worldview." That's profound. So I know that these exchanges have relevance in many ways. Our forests are subject to their own kind of exploitation policies. This is a clear cut of Mears Island in Clayoquot Sound, about the early 1990s, when the War of the Woods started, with the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation leading the way on West Coast Vancouver Island. I fit into this forest ecology paradigm with Suzanne because I noticed that there were some observations in some of our Chinook abundance in the Fraser River that we didn't anticipate through a technical working group. In the pine beetle forests in the Fraser River system, which is BC's longest river, there were a couple of Chinook stocks that actually increased abundance. And that was surprising. So we realized that the government programs didn't have the capacity or the resources to answer that type of a question. So I took it upon myself to enter into a forestry program so that I could address habitat issues. Because for many years, Aboriginal people had been advocating to look at the habitat, to treat the fish differently, to treat the habitat, make sure we were providing the stewardship. And that's how I met Professor Suzanne Simard. And we have such a like mind, and we travel often together to many events. And ironically, Suzanne's first job was actually out of forestry school to lay out old growth forests for clear cutting. This had an interesting, devastating impact on her, how she felt about forests, having grown up in them. The plan was to replant these clear cuts with monocultures of pines and firs and weed out the taller birches and aspens because these were unwanted weeds, it was thought, competing and interfering with corporate profits. Suzanne started noticing, though, that the trees in these shiny new plantations were stressed. Why was disease spreading through roots of the planted trees? Why was weeding birch making these plantations so sick? She was also worried about the rate of clear cutting. In Canada, most of the working forest is marked for cutting on 50 to 120-year rotation, depending on where you are. There are no plans for letting these forests grow to old age again. This is our backyard today. like everyone's backyard in the Pacific Northwest. We find few signs of honorable harvest here. Stressed plantations coalesce into a stressed landscape that are at risk of even more disturbance, more disease, more drought, and more fire. Suzanne says, I knew our relationship with the forest was broken, and she wanted to help heal it. She wanted to heal the forest. So she returned to graduate work where she became fascinated by a UK study in 1982 when scientists discovered in the lab that mycorrhizal fungi colonizing the roots of seedlings served as pipelines for transmission of carbon from one seedling to the other. Mycorrhizas are literally fungus roots. This is a universal symbiotic relationship where the fungus trades nutrients it gathers from the soil for photosynthetic carbon from the tree. Both benefit. Let's take a moment here. This UK study was published in Nature, a pillar of credibility in Western science. Yet, Soubier's ancient teachings of the tree people and their symbiotic fungal networks, considered, quote, crucial to the survival of future generations, has been completely ignored. It is considered non-scientific and discredited. But make no mistake, this indigenous knowledge is deeply scientific, gained through thousands of years of observation, trial and error. We have ignored it as a society. The mycorrhizal fungi to form mushrooms like these Amanita muscarias we commonly see in the forest. These mushrooms are the tip of the iceberg. The mycelia, the fine white threads emanating from the stem, run hundreds of kilometers beneath a single footstep. When she read Reed's study, she thought about those sick fir forests. Could mycorrhizal fungi colonizing the birch somehow link with and protect the firs? Could killing the birch kill the symbiotic mycelia and thus kill the fir? Could these mycorrhizal networks occur in real forests, not just in a lab in the UK? It turns out they do. Using DNA microsatellites to distinguish all of the trees, mushrooms, and mycorrhizal root tips in this forest, we were able to map the underground network in the Douglas fir forest. The green circles in this map represent Douglas fir, where the darkest, largest nodes are the big old trees, and the lighter, smaller nodes are seedlings in the understory. The lines are the interlinking mycorrhizal fungal highways. We call the big, most highly connected trees, or hubs, or mother trees, because we found in later experiments that they actually nurture the young ones. This is a map of only 2 of about 100 fungal species in this forest. Imagine if we had mapped all 100 species. What's moving through these connections? Well, the very resources that trees need to survive: carbon, nitrogen, water. These were transmitting back and forth like messages through the internet. When one tree was in need, when it was shaded or small or thirsty, its neighbor would send more energy through the network. The resources were traveling along a gradient from a robust source to a tree in needful sink, from birch to fir, and reciprocally from fir to birch. But what does it matter to the forest? Where source trees were shaded, sink trees sent up to 10% of their carbon. This is a lot. It's enough carbon to support seed production. Now, get this, the direction of net transfer between birch and fir changed over the year. depending on which species was replete and which was in need. In the spring, when fir was growing and birch was still breaking bud, fir sent more carbon to birch. In summer, when birch was shading fir, birch sent more to fir. This reversed again in the fall, when fir was still photosynthesizing while birch was senescing. We have found that this is linked to increased survival and growth. Well, she still wondered how fir was protected from infection by pathogens when grown together with birch, but not when it was alone. Well, when fir is injured or sick, it turns out, it sends warning signals to its neighbors through mycorrhizal networks. The neighbors responded by making defense enzymes to fend off disease. When the neighbor is a birch, the fir is also protected by antibiotic-producing bacteria that are shared among the root systems, like a public immunization program. Not only defense signals, we also found evidence that trees could recognize their relatives. Mother trees sent more carbon to neighboring kin seedling than to strangers, supporting even larger mycorrhizal networks. When a mother tree was injured, she transmitted even more carbon to her kin as though she was leaving her energy, her legacy, to the next generation. Let's take a moment to think about the ancient story of the tree people told by Subier. He said, under the forest floor, there is an intricate and vast system of roots and fungi that keeps the forest strong. The Swinomish say, the story of the tree people captures an important teaching for building alliances, communal strength, diversity, and roles each member has in the web of the whole community. Together, we are stronger in Samat. In our current work, we've become interested not only in the linkages between the trees, but between the trees, the salmon, the bears, and their people. Remember, we're using ancient fish traps. The Aboriginal people depended upon and took care of the salmon. While spawning in rivers, in the fall, the bears and wolves also fish for salmon. The bears carry the fish up the stream banks, then feed on them under the sheltering crowns of mother trees. We think the leftover salmon bodies decay, and the trees soak up the salmon nitrogen through their mycorrhizal networks. Traces of salmon nitrogen have been found in tree rings, stored there for centuries. In one old spruce tree, scientist Tom Reimken estimated that 80% of its total nitrogen was derived from salmon. This summer, we're looking at how these trees might send this nitrogen to neighboring trees, from tree to tree, deep in the forest. We think this boosts the health of the forest, cycles back to the rivers, the oceans, and the people, in addition to providing healthy habitat for salmon. This is a demonstration of how things are all connected. The integrity of this circle of life depends on what the Aboriginal people call reciprocity, the trait of mutual respect. This is an example of how people are embedded in complex adaptive systems in nature. So we see that these species are represented by nodes and relationships. In our Western culture, though, we think of them as separate, but they're all connected. The way that we have been managing our forests have led us to what's known as wicked stable states. We have been practicing forestry that is not consistent with these cycles, and we're ending up with forests that are dead. Then they become vulnerable to catastrophic events, as you've witnessed, as everyone in this room is aware. So it's important for us to understand that we have to nurture those connections in the forest so that we can prevent these types of activities. from occurring in the future. We are the balance, the 7 generations. We take our knowledge from the 7 generations before us and we apply it so that the 7 generations in the future have the same benefits of what we call home, Earth. Thank you. Thank you. It's going to make me cry. Thank you so much. Thank you.